Sound of wind across desert sand. A single glass tower catches the rising sun. Dubai awakens. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the moments before a decision is made. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of weight, of consequence, of something about to be determined that cannot be undetermined. In the spring of 2019, in a corner office on the 32nd floor of Al Noor Construction's headquarters on Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai, that silence was about to be broken by a laugh. And that laugh would cost everyone in the room more than they could possibly know. Wide aerial shot of Dubai's skyline. Construction cranes dotting the horizon. The desert stretching endlessly beyond. Dubai is not a city that happened. It is a city that was decided. Decades ago, it was sand and shoreline. A trading port. A modest dot on maps that most of the world never thought to look at twice. And then, through a combination of extraordinary vision, extraordinary wealth, and an almost defiant refusal to accept limitations, it became something else entirely. By 2019, Dubai's skyline was one of the most photographed in the world. The Burj Khalifa. The Burj Al Arab. The twisting spire of the Cayenne Tower. Structures that didn't just house people, they announced something. They announced that in this corner of the earth, the rules of what was possible had been rewritten. And the engineers who built those structures? They became legends. In a city obsessed with firsts, with tallest, with most ambitious, the engineers were the quiet architects of the impossible. They worked in the background, behind developers and architects and politicians who took the credit at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. But every person in the industry knew who actually made the buildings stand. And for 30 years, in Dubai, one name stood above the rest. Rashid Al Mansouri. Interior, Al Noor Construction. Rashid's corner office. Morning light. Scale models on every shelf. Rashid had not inherited his reputation. He had built it the same way he built everything, one calculated decision at a time. He had studied structural engineering in London in the late 1980s, at a time when very few engineers from the Gulf were pursuing postgraduate degrees in the UK. He had graduated with distinction. He had returned to Dubai when the city was still finding its ambitions, and he had grown alongside it, each project more complex than the last, each structure taller, each engineering challenge more intricate. His first major commission had been a 16-story commercial building in Dera in 1994. Standard by today's standards. But at the time, the foundation conditions, soft sand over brackish groundwater, had stumped two other firms before Rashid proposed a solution involving a triple-layer pile system that became an industry reference in the Gulf for the next 15 years. After that, the commissions came faster, higher, more complex. By 2019, Rashid had designed or co-engineered over 40 significant structures in the UAE. 3 of them had won international engineering awards. None of them, not one, had experienced a structural failure of any kind. In 30 years, his buildings had never failed. That record was not just professional. For Rashid, it was identity. It was the answer to every question about who he was. It was the armor he wore and the ground he stood on. He was a compact man in his late 50s, always precisely dressed, with silver at his temples and glasses he wore on a cord around his neck and only raised to his eyes when he needed to make a point. He spoke slowly. He chose his words the way he chose his materials, for load-bearing capacity, not decoration. His office reflected his mind. Ordered. Efficient. Everything in its correct position. Scale models of his major projects lined 3 shelves behind his desk, tiny perfect reproductions of buildings that scraped the Dubai sky. The awards hung in identical frames, equally spaced, on the wall to his right. When he sat at his mahogany desk, he looked like a man who had already seen every version of every problem and solved most of them before breakfast. He looked, in other words, like a man who had stopped being curious, because he had decided he already knew enough. The Emirates Green Tower was not just another project. It had been conceived 2 years earlier by a consortium of developers, government sustainability officials, and international environmental architects. The vision was simple in concept, staggering in execution: a 40-story mixed-use tower that would operate at net-zero carbon emissions, built using innovative sustainable materials, designed to function in the extreme heat of the Arabian Peninsula without the punishing energy costs that plague virtually every other tall building in the region. If successful, it would be the most ambitious sustainable skyscraper in the Middle East, possibly in the world. The project had attracted proposals from 14 engineering firms across 9 countries. Over 18 months, the selection committee had reviewed, debated, and narrowed the field to 5 finalists. Each finalist had submitted a comprehensive proposal: months of work, hundreds of pages of data, technical specifications, material analyses, and structural modeling. The 5 proposals sat in the committee room, waiting for the final review. 4 of them were from large, established international firms: London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, New York. The 5th had arrived from Manila, Philippines. Rashid's assistant, Nur, a sharp, quiet woman who had worked with him for 11 years and had learned to read his moods the way a sailor reads weather, placed the last of the 5 proposals on his desk that Tuesday morning. She set it down carefully, as she always did with everything. "Mr. Al-Mansuri," she said, "this just arrived from Manila." Rashid looked up from the structural report he had been reading. His reading glasses came up to his eyes. "Manila," he said. "The Philippines." Nur nodded. He looked at the folder for a moment before picking it up. It was thick, nearly 2 inches of paper. Someone had put serious work into this. He noted that. He opened it to the cover page. "Sustainable Vertical Design, a proposal for the Emirates Green Tower. Garcia Engineering Solutions. Lead engineer Carlos Garcia." Rashid didn't know that name. That was itself unusual. In his world, the significant engineers knew each other, not personally, perhaps, but by reputation, by publication, by project history. The name Carlos Garcia produced nothing in his memory. He began reading. The executive summary was well structured, professional. The language was precise without being arrogant, the kind of writing that came from someone who had been trained not just to engineer but to communicate. Rashid noted that too. He turned the pages steadily, his expression neutral, professional. Page 3. Structural Overview. Competent. Page 7. Sustainability Metrics. Detailed. Some interesting projections on passive cooling. Page 9. Material Specifications. He slowed here. Something in the material breakdown was unexpected. He turned to page 12. And he stopped. And then he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was not the kind of polite, dismissive exhale that professionals use to signal skepticism without rudeness. It was a full, genuine, echoing laugh, the kind that rises from the chest and fills the room before the laughing person even realizes it has escaped them. Nur stood very still. Rashid held up the page. A structural blueprint showing a 40-story building's load-bearing framework, but rendered not in steel, not in reinforced concrete, not in any of the materials that had built every significant structure in this city, but in an engineered composite derived, according to the notation at the bottom of the page, from bamboo. "This Filipino engineer," Rashid said, still smiling, turning the page to face Nur as though she might share in his amusement, "wants to integrate bamboo into a 40-story skyscraper." He shook his head. "Bamboo. In Dubai." He lowered the page and looked at the rest of the blueprint with something between fascination and pity. "Does he think we're building a beach hut?" Nur said nothing. Rashid kept reading, his smile steady, his amusement building as he turned pages. He read aloud, his tone carrying the cadence of someone reading a children's story to an imaginary audience. "He claims bamboo has better tensile strength than steel in certain applications." He turned another page. "That it's more flexible during seismic events." Another page. "That it's sustainable. Carbon neutral during production." He closed the folder, squared it against the edge of his desk with 2 deliberate taps, and pushed it to the side. "File this under rejected," he said, picking up his reading glasses and returning to the report he had been reviewing before Noor entered. We're building the future of Dubai. Not a jungle resort. Noor hesitated. And Noor almost never hesitated. Sir, she said carefully, the proposal does have some impressive data. His stress tests show. I don't care what his tests show. Rashid said it without looking up. Flat. Final. Not angry. Not cruel. Simply closed. I've been building structures in this region for 3 decades. I know what works in this climate, in this soil, in this wind profile. Bamboo belongs in furniture. Not skyscrapers. Noor picked up the folder. She did not file it under rejected. She placed it on the shelf behind her own desk, in the section she privately labeled, in 11 years of working for Rashid, things he may want to reconsider. She had never once needed to retrieve anything from that shelf. She hoped this would be the same. The selection committee convened the following morning on the 28th floor of Al Noor's headquarters. 5 developers. 2 senior officials from Dubai's Sustainability Authority. Rashid, as chief structural advisor to the committee, sat at the head of the long glass table. The 5 proposals were reviewed in sequence. Each firm had been given a summary slot, 15 minutes to be represented by their documentation, their data, and whatever Rashid and the committee chose to say about them. The London firm's proposal was sophisticated. Steel and glass. Proven. Safe. Expensive. The Tokyo firm's proposal was technically brilliant but costed 40% above the project budget. It was, by consensus, admirable and impractical. The Frankfurt firm had submitted a hybrid concrete and timber design that generated genuine interest around the table. 2 of the developers asked questions. Discussion ran over time. The New York firm's proposal was polished and comprehensive. Their track record in sustainable construction was strong. Several committee members nodded as it was presented. Then the 5th proposal came up. Rashid kept his presentation of the Garcia file to under 90 seconds. This proposal, he said, without opening the folder, comes from a small engineering firm in the Philippines with no track record in large-scale vertical construction. The structural framework it proposes relies on an experimental bamboo composite material that has not been certified for use in structures above 8 stories in any jurisdiction, including the Philippines. The proposal, while creatively framed, does not meet the threshold of engineering reliability required for a project of this scale and international visibility. He set the folder aside. I would recommend we not invest further committee time in this submission. There was a pause. One of the government officials, a younger man named Saif, who had been added to the committee 6 months earlier as part of Dubai's push to incorporate sustainability specialists into development decisions, looked at the folder. Did we verify the bamboo data independently? He asked. There's nothing to verify, Rashid said. The material hasn't been certified for this application. But the certification process would take 2 years minimum, Rashid said. We break ground in 14 months. Saif nodded slowly and said nothing more. The Garcia proposal was officially eliminated. That afternoon, a standard notification email was generated by Al Noor's project management system. 2 sentences. We appreciate your submission. After careful review, your proposal has not been selected to move forward. It was sent to the contact email on the Garcia Engineering Solutions letterhead. In Manila, it arrived at 11:47 p.m., local time. Carlos Garcia was 36 years old. He had grown up in Quezon City, the son of a civil engineer who had spent his career designing provincial roads and municipal drainage systems in Luzon. Engineering had not been handed to Carlos as a legacy. It had been earned, argued for, saved for. His father had wanted him to study medicine. His mother had wanted him close to home. Carlos had wanted to understand why things stood up. He had studied structural engineering at the University of the Philippines Diliman on a partial scholarship, supplementing his tuition by tutoring mathematics to high school students on weekends. He had graduated second in his cohort. He had applied for a research fellowship in materials science at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, where he spent 2 years studying the structural properties of natural fiber composites. It was there, in a laboratory in Singapore, that Carlos Garcia first put engineered bamboo under a load-testing machine and watched it perform. What he saw changed the direction of his career. Bamboo, specifically the mozo species, when harvested at optimal maturity and processed using a cross-lamination technique his research team had been developing, demonstrated tensile strength properties that, in certain loading configurations, matched or exceeded those of common structural steel grades. It was lighter. It was more flexible, an advantage in seismic events where rigid structures cracked while flexible ones bent and recovered. And it was renewable in a way that no metal could be. A mozo bamboo grove could be harvested and regrown within 5 to 7 years. Carlos spent the next 4 years after Singapore developing the engineering framework to take this material from laboratory results to real-world application. He founded Garcia Engineering Solutions with 2 colleagues from his Singapore cohort. They started small, consulting, material testing, small residential builds in Cebu and Davao using bamboo composite panels and non-structural applications. Then they pushed further. By 2018, Carlos had developed a structural system he called the Bamboo Core Framework, a hybrid load-bearing architecture that used engineered bamboo composite beams in the building's primary structural core, combined with conventional reinforced concrete at foundation and transfer floor levels. He had modeled it for structures up to 60 stories. He had run over 3,000 computational simulations. He had presented the preliminary findings at a regional engineering conference in Kuala Lumpur where 2 professors from Japan and 1 from the Netherlands had asked to see his full data. When the Emirates Green Tower call for proposals was announced, Carlos saw it not as a reach, but as the exact project his framework had been designed for. He spent 11 months on the proposal. He hired a technical writer. He commissioned independent stress testing from a certified laboratory in Singapore. He had his computational models reviewed by a professor at the National University of Singapore who had no financial stake in the outcome. The proposal he submitted was not an experiment. It was a proof. He went to bed on the night the deadline passed, for the first time in 11 months, without thinking about it. 3 weeks later, at 11:47 p.m., his laptop chimed with a new email notification. He read it once. Then again. Then he closed the laptop, sat in the quiet of his studio for a long moment, and went to make himself a cup of coffee. Some people, when rejected, diminish. The energy that had sustained them through months of work suddenly has nowhere to go. The deflation is physical, chemical, a collapse that can last days or weeks or, in some cases, permanently redirect a life away from the thing that caused the pain. Carlos Garcia was not that kind of person. This was not because he was unaffected. He was affected. He had believed in that proposal with the quiet, bone-deep conviction of someone who had spent 4 years building toward a single moment of demonstration. The rejection stung in a way he would not fully articulate until years later, in an interview, when he described it simply as, "like being told your native language doesn't count as a real language." But Carlos had not built his career on the approval of people who already understood what he was doing. He had built it by finding the one person in every room willing to look at the data before making up their mind. He simply needed to find a different room. 6 weeks after the Dubai rejection, Carlos submitted a revised version of the Bamboo Core proposal, adapted for local seismic conditions and adjusted to an 8-story pilot scale, to a sustainable development competition in Malaysia. The competition was smaller, less prestigious. The prize money wouldn't cover 3 months of his firm's operating costs. He won. The prize came with something more valuable than money, an introduction to a Kuala Lumpur developer named Ahmad Faisal, who was planning a 14-story mixed-use residential and commercial development in Petaling Jaya and who had, in his own words, been looking for exactly this kind of structural approach for 2 years without knowing it existed. Ahmad read the full proposal. All of it. Construction began in early 2020. Building the Petaling Jaya Tower was not simple. The bamboo composite beams, manufactured by a certified facility in Fujian, China, that Carlos had partnered with after his Singapore research, had to be transported, stored at controlled humidity, and installed using modified connection hardware that Carlos's team had spent 8 months designing and testing. Local contractors had to be trained. Building inspectors had to be educated. There were 3 regulatory review meetings before the structural system received its building permit. There were also 2 minor seismic events during the construction period, tremors measuring 3.2 and 3.8 on the Richter scale, originating from a fault system 60 kilometers east of the construction site. The bamboo core frame performed exactly as Carlos's models had predicted. The building moved microscopically, with each tremor, the engineered flexibility of the bamboo composite absorbing and dispersing the lateral energy in a way that a rigid steel frame would not have. Not a single structural connection was compromised. Not one crack appeared in the frame. The building was completed in late 2021. It came in 6% under budget, primarily due to the lower material cost of bamboo composite versus structural steel at current market prices. Energy performance testing in the first operational years showed that the building's cooling loads ran 38% below regional average for a comparable structure, partly due to the building's passive design features, and partly due to the thermal properties of the bamboo composite walls, which provided natural insulation that reduced the work required from mechanical cooling systems. The architect who had partnered with Carlos on the project submitted it to the Asia-Pacific Sustainable Design Awards. It won. Then it won the Global Green Build Prize. Then Architectural Digest ran a feature. The headline called Carlos Garcia, the engineer who made the skyscraper grow. The engineering press followed. Then the general press. Then the international press. And somewhere in all of that coverage, in an interview Carlos gave to a Malaysian engineering journal, he was asked whether he had submitted the bamboo core system to any projects before peddling Jaya. Yes, he said. A project in Dubai, in 2019. The Emirates Green Tower. The interviewer asked what had happened. Carlos was quiet for a moment. It was rejected, he said. I understood the skepticism. The material sounds unusual in that context. I just needed someone willing to read past the name of the material and look at what the data actually showed. He paused. Ahmad read the data. That made all the difference. Rashid Al-Mansouri read the Architectural Digest feature on a Thursday evening in late 2022, on the tablet he kept on his desk for industry reading. He did not read it looking for Carlos Garcia's name. He read it because the headline had caught his eye. The engineer who made the skyscraper grow. And because in 30 years of industry reading, a headline that genuinely surprised him was rare enough to merit attention. He read the whole article. Then he sat very still for a while. Then he searched Garcia Engineering Solutions and read the firm's project page. Then he found the Asia Pacific Award citation and read that. Then he found the interview with the Malaysian Engineering Journal and read that too. He read Carlos's answer about the Dubai rejection 3 times. I just needed someone willing to read past the name of the material and look at what the data actually showed. Rashid took off his glasses. He set them on the desk. He looked out at the Dubai skyline, the buildings he knew by structure, by history, by the specific engineering decisions that had made each one possible. His buildings were out there, somewhere in that lit grid of glass and steel. Standing perfectly. Never failed. He thought about the folder. He thought about page 12. He thought about the laugh. He thought about Nur, hesitating at the door. Sir, the proposal has some impressive data. His stress tests show. I don't care what his tests show. In 30 years of engineering, Rashid had never said that. Not once, not to a colleague, not to a developer, not to a junior engineer presenting preliminary findings he disagreed with. The data was always the conversation. Everything else was argument. You engaged with the data. You challenged the data. You tested the data against your own experience and your own knowledge. But you did not dismiss it because the name of the material surprised you. He had not done engineering that night. He had done something else, something he could not name comfortably, and he had dressed it in the language of experience and expertise to make it feel like a professional decision. It had not been a professional decision. He knew that now. He had perhaps known it then, in the quiet after Nur left the room. But knowing and acknowledging our different acts, and Rashid had spent 30 years being right often enough that the habit of confidence had, on one Thursday morning in 2019, become the habit of certainty, which is a different thing entirely. Certainty doesn't read past page 12. Certainty already knows. The Emirates Green Tower had been completed in 2022. It was everything Rashid had promised. The structure was flawless. The solar integration worked. The grey water systems performed above projections. The building had received a Platinum Sustainability certification and had been featured in 4 architectural publications. At the opening ceremony, the lead developer had praised Rashid by name. The mayor of the district had shaken his hand. By any external measure, it was a triumph. Rashid walked through the lobby on a quiet afternoon a few weeks after reading the Architectural Digest article. He looked at the steel columns. He looked at the curtain wall glazing. He looked at everything he had designed and everything he had built, and he allowed himself to hold 2 thoughts at the same time. This building is excellent. And another building, built differently, with a different kind of courage, might also have been excellent. The 2 thoughts were not in conflict. That was what surprised him. He had half expected to arrive at a choice, to decide which truth was true, the way he had always decided which structural approach was correct. But both things were simply, simultaneously true. His building stood. It was good. And Carlos Garcia's framework, which he had laughed at on a Tuesday morning, had also proven itself, in a different city, with a developer who had been willing to read all the way to the end. The question that stayed with Rashid, the one that would not leave him for many months, was not whether he had made the right technical decision. Perhaps, given the timeline and certification constraints, rejecting the proposal had been defensible on pure project management grounds. The question was, at what moment had his professional assessment ended and something else begun? At what point, precisely, had expertise become a reason not to learn? Rashid al-Mansouri was not a man who apologized easily. This was not because he was arrogant in his personal life. Those who knew him outside of work described him as quietly generous, devoted to his family, genuinely kind. It was simply that in his professional life, he had rarely been wrong. And the muscles required for a particular kind of honesty, the honesty of acknowledged error, had not been exercised in a very long time. He wrote the letter by hand. He had considered email. Email was faster, cleaner, more appropriate by contemporary professional standards. But he found, when he sat down to draft it electronically, that the medium felt insufficient. Email had the quality of something sent, dispatched, forwarded, filed. A letter had to be carried. It required more from the person who wrote it. He wrote it over 3 evenings. The first evening, he tore up what he had written because it read like a technical assessment, a professional correction of the record, bloodless and self-protective. The second evening, he got further but stopped at a sentence that began with the word "however," and recognized that any letter of genuine acknowledgement that contained the word "however" had not yet become what it needed to be. The third evening, he wrote it straight through. He told Carlos Garcia that he had reviewed his 2019 proposal, that he had not read it in its entirety before making his recommendation to the committee, that his recommendation had been influenced by assumptions that were not engineering-based, assumptions he was not proud of, about what materials were appropriate, about what firms from what countries were capable of, about what he, with 30 years of experience, needed to learn. He said he had been wrong. He did not qualify it. He did not explain it away. He did not attach a "but." He had been wrong. He said so. He closed the letter by saying that 3 major Gulf engineering firms were now actively researching bamboo composite applications for mid-rise construction, that the data Carlos had submitted in 2019 had since been validated by independent research institutions in Japan, the Netherlands, and Australia, and that if Garcia Engineering Solutions had any future interest in projects in the Gulf region, he would be honored to be considered as a collaborator. He folded the letter. He sealed the envelope. He wrote the Manila address by hand. He posted it the next morning on his way into the office. The letter arrived in Manila on a Wednesday. Carlos Garcia read it at his desk, in the morning, before his team arrived. He read it slowly. He read it again. He had not expected it. In the years since the Dubai rejection, he had not thought much about Rashid al-Mansouri, not out of bitterness, but simply because the work had kept moving and the work had proven itself, and the energy required to carry resentment toward a man he had never met had always seemed like energy better spent on load calculations. But reading the letter, he felt something he hadn't anticipated. Not vindication. Not the sharp satisfaction of being proven right by the person who had dismissed you. Something quieter than that. Something closer to recognition, the feeling of having been seen, finally, accurately, by someone who had initially looked away. He thought about his father, who had spent decades building roads in provinces that would never make headlines, who had always said that the work either holds or it doesn't, and the work would eventually tell its own truth regardless of who was watching. The work had told its truth. Carlos Garcia sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he opened his laptop and composed a reply. He kept it short. Mr. Al-Mansouri, he wrote. Thank you for your letter. The generosity it represents is not lost on me. I understand that the 2019 timeline presented real constraints, and I have never assumed that the decision was made carelessly. I am currently in preliminary discussions regarding a project in Abu Dhabi. I would be very glad to have Garcia Engineering Solutions and Al Noor Consulting in conversation about that project. I'd be honored. He signed it. He sent it. Then he went back to work. In 2024, a structural engineering proposal was submitted to a development authority in Abu Dhabi for a 12-story sustainable commercial building in the city's new Green Development District. The proposal was jointly authored by Garcia Engineering Solutions, Manila, and Al Noor Consulting, Dubai. The lead engineers were listed as Carlos Garcia and Rashid al-Mansouri. The structural framework proposed a hybrid system, engineered bamboo composite primary beams, reinforced concrete core, and a passive cooling facade designed for the specific thermal conditions of the Arabian Peninsula. It was approved. Groundbreaking was scheduled for 2025. This is not, in the end, a story about bamboo versus steel. It is not a story about Dubai versus Manila, or East versus West, or innovation versus tradition. Those frames exist in the story, and they are real. The assumptions Rashid made about what a firm from the Philippines could offer, about what materials from outside the Western engineering canon deserved serious consideration, those assumptions were real, and their consequences were real. Carlos Garcia felt them. They shaped years of his professional life. But the story doesn't end with a villain and a victim. It ends with a letter. It ends with a man who had spent 30 years being right, sitting alone with a piece of paper and a pen, in a corner office in a city he had helped build, finding the courage to say, I was wrong. I looked away. I let something other than engineering guide an engineering decision, and I am sorry. And it ends with the reply, I'd be honored. There is a particular kind of strength that the most successful people are rarely asked to demonstrate, the strength of the open hand. The strength of admitting that experience, however real and however earned, does not complete a person. That certainty, left unchecked, becomes a wall. That the greatest engineers, the greatest thinkers, the greatest human beings, are not the ones who have never been wrong. They are the ones who, when they are, find the courage to say so. And then go back to work. Silence. Then, softly, the sound of wind through a bamboo grove.